All right, so here we go. So now we'll start all over. This is the 2021 annual training for the Greensboro Minimum Housing Standards Commission. It is recording for everyone. Some of the council persons did reach out and they want to be able to watch, so we're going to record it for their benefit. Plus, we did add it so that where the public's not going to be in the room, they can watch, because this is a public meeting, because there are more than 4 of you present and we are conducting business. Even though we're not hearing the case, you are going to be cooperating or collaborating together about how you do your job and your role. And just like Michelle said, certainly ask questions. If you're not able to interrupt us as we go along, just write your question down so that we can get it in the end. And even if there's questions and stuff afterward, we certainly want to be able to answer that. But like I said before, I'm your staff liaison, so you have any problems or anything whatsoever, that's part of my responsibility, is to make sure that I get you what you need. All right.
And briefly, we've broken this up into 2 basic sections. Troy's going to go through the nuts and bolts of the commission, how it works, appointments, general scope of authority, and then I'm going to talk about legal authority for the commission. So if you have questions about the legal authority, write it down, and we'll definitely bring it up towards the end. Also, it's 10. We'll probably take a break, 10:30, 10:45. We like to talk. If we're blowing through that break, don't hesitate to say, give us 5 minutes, and we'll do that.
And also, those who may not know in the room, this is Judy Decker. She is the court reporter for the Housing Commission. So we have to keep the minutes and everything recorded anytime that we have a quorum present. So those of you who may not know Judy, she does have staff when we're in person. Who's the other gentleman that joins us? Misty. Okay. All right. And those of you that may not know, if you know the budget director, John Decker, this is his mother. Yeah.
And just before we go on to anything else, because I realize that many of y'all may not know me, but many of you may not know each other. So if we can just do a quick, because I know we have some new commission members, so everybody knows who's in the room and what we've got going on. You want to kick us off?
My name is Bolton. And I'm Peter Rosenthal, I hear Housing Commission.
And if you, and thank you, I apologize. Aaron's in my office. If you get information from my office, a lot of times it'll be from Aaron.
And you may realize that there are some open seats for the commissioner today. We did a training last week with one of our minimum housing commissioners. So we've already given her, or 2 of our minimum housing commissioners. So some folks have already gotten this, and then there are some open seats that hopefully will be filled coming up soon.
So we're going to get started. Y'all do see on our flanks, this is Roddy Covington. This is Carla Harrison. Both of those are field supervisors for the code inspectors. They are camera people today, so that we can be sure that we capture the room for the training. All right, so what we'll go over is these objectives. Everybody see the TVs really good? All right. Is the overview of the Housing Commission, code compliance, ordinance enforcement on how a case arrives at the commission, the legal powers and duties of the Housing Commission, and additional ways that community improvement helps to improve housing. Oh, I'm not used to sitting down, I'm used to walking. All right, so the commission is set up of 7 members. It's 7 regular members and 2 alternate members. When we do have an alternate member that is seated, what happens is at the beginning of the meeting, if there are less than 7, then the chair will recognize the alternate as a voting member. And that's one of the things that myself and Tony will be sure to capture the chair or vice chair's attention, just to let them know. But when we're in the council chambers, the alternate sits at the dais. The alternate does participate in the meeting, participates in discussion, because we don't want, when the alternate is able to participate, we don't want that to be unfamiliar. We want them to have been having dialogue with the cases as everything goes along, okay? But at the beginning of the meeting, if all 7 members are not present, then a alternate is recognized as a voting member. Terms is 3-year terms, and members may serve 2 consecutive terms. Now, if your initial appointment is to replace a member, then when you come into that term to finish that member's term, if you serve more than half of the time of that term, that is considered 1 term. That's considered a full term. The reason that's important is when you look in the staff handbook, which we'll send that to you, in the staff handbook for the Housing Commission, it says that a commissioner serves 2 terms, which is 6 years, 3 and 3, and then you have to take a 1-year break. And then you can be reappointed back and serve 2 more terms. It just simply says you can't keep succeeding yourself once you arrive to your 6th year of service. A quorum is required with a majority vote of the members to decide any matter. Now, one of the things that Tony will share later on is to overturn an inspector's decision, you will always have to have 4 votes. 4 is your quorum of 7. So you can have a meeting if you have 4 people present, but if the inspectors ask you to uphold their decision, all 4 will have to support the reversal of the inspector. If you have 3 to 1, then the inspector's decision stays up. Did I just make that clear? Did I confuse that? Okay. All members shall hold office until their successor is appointed. So if your term expires, that's on your council appointment letter. If your term expires, then you remain seated and you remain in full force where you can vote until your city council person reappoints or appoints a replacement. No member shall discuss or vote on any matter that they have a private interest on. If there's a case coming up, and this is I know the chair Chairman Isikoff has recused himself a couple times if the person is represented by someone in his law firm. So if you have a family member, relative, or somebody in which you do not believe you can make an unbiased decision, then it's probably best that you recuse yourself, or at least make it known to the commission. Just raise your hand before the case is even heard when it comes up and say, hey, let me tell you all this. So you share what you think is a conflict. We can decide, we can help you decide or give you feedback if we think it is or is not a conflict, but the commission, the body itself, can vote and determine conflict or no conflict. So if you give your explanation and you believe that you don't have a conflict, but Councilperson Furman believes that it is a conflict, Councilperson Furman can ask the body to vote on it. And if the body decides it's a conflict, then you would have to recuse yourself from the dais and participate in no discussion and in no voting until that case is concluded, and then you would automatically join back in. Let's see, the chair and vice chair are elected to a 2-year term. So while they're in office, so the last election was last year, August of 2020. So it happens just like clockwork every 2 years. So the next election that will automatically occur would be August of 2022. And if there's any vacancies anywhere in time as we move through, then we hold an election at the next regular meeting. Hearings are held on the 2nd Thursday of each month at 1:30. They're generally in the council chambers. However, right now we're completely virtual with Zoom by order of the city manager for COVID protection. Hearings are held in an informal manner in accordance with Robert's rules. What that means is in Robert's rules of order, if you follow the strict rule, then you have certain things like where the chair generally does not involve themselves in the discussion. The chair simply facilitates the discussion that everyone's talking about. In the informal part of those rules, the chair can make a motion, the chair can second a motion, and the chair can participate in discussion, but it should be minimal. One of the things that you do if you're the chair, and the reason I'm giving all these instructions to everyone is because if your chair is absent, your vice chair leads the meeting. If your vice chair and your chair is absent, If you have 4 members left, the 4 of you have to appoint somebody to lead your meeting. Okay? So everybody kind of needs to know the role of the chair. So when you, so on the informal part, if the chair is really passionate about this case, about a case and wants to participate in discussion, the chair should pass the gavel to the vice chair or to another member so they can participate in discussion. The reason that is when you're participating in that discussion, if the chair is doing all the talking, there's nobody to stop the chair from talking. That's the reason you move the gavel. Because in a meeting, when you have the chair facilitating that meeting, the chair controls that time and makes sure that everybody is heard and makes everybody gets a chance and picks which order everybody's in. So nobody's supposed to be talking unless you're recognized by the chair. So if the gavel comes to you because the chair wants to participate in the discussion, now you know what the facilitator is supposed to do as well. Let's see, the commission may accept oral evidence under oath and reliable written documents, photographs, and videos. One of the things, and I know I'm not going to get too much into Tony's presentation because some of the things he'll be sharing with you. But if I was to use an example of what the role of a quasi-judicial board is you're going to get a packet from us 2 days prior to the hearing. Prior to your meeting, it gives you a chance to look at what the inspector's order is, what information that we as staff plan to present. So that lets you kind of highlight, make some notes, or put something together that you may want to ask a question. However, it should stop there. You really shouldn't visit the property. You shouldn't call. You shouldn't do your own investigative stuff into the matter. And the reason that is because your decision that you base in the hearing is only based upon the evidence that is presented to you during that hearing. Your decision is subject to review by Superior Court. So if the person does not agree, the appellate does not agree, or I said appellate, applicant, the other party does not agree with your decision, they can appeal your decision to Superior Court. If the city's not agreeable with the decision, the city can appeal that decision to Superior Court and have it heard to look after on each other's best interest or each other's interest. So, and what happens is the record of the hearing goes to Superior Court, and that's what they're going to review. They're going to look at any recordings, they're going to look at the transcript, they're going to look at the packets that were submitted, and that's how they're going to base their decision. When they decide whether to remand it back or whether to support it and say that, yes, all the rules and procedures were followed. So with you being the official that has the same powers as I, as a compliance officer, you collectively, from your council person appointments, you collectively are citizens that's listening to it, to add the fairness to it, to make sure that yes, what the inspector has done, they have followed the rule. They have followed this policy. Yes, that is correct. And if all is correct, then you make your decision. But you make your decision within the realm of that evidence that was submitted, and no other influences or no other biases. Once you get out of that hearing, then there's a later part that we put in your meeting. Then you can have this discussion and reflection. And we have placed a place for this at the end of your agenda that will remain permanent. So that after you've heard all of your cases, then at the end, you can start giving reflection on the case or on an idea or to staff, because I'm the manager of all the inspectors that's going to send cases to you. I need to know training. I need to know what was difficult on you making your decision, what evidence that you would like to have seen, so that we can train the inspectors or make sure our documentation is up to par. So one of the things, oral evidence, one of the things that you cannot hear is hearsay. All right. So if a person starts to say, well, Johnny was over here, then the chair stops them, or Tony's gonna try to interrupt and say that you're starting to hear hearsay. Hearsay is not eligible. And the same goes for us too. The inspector cannot give testimony, and if Carla's not present, I can't say, well, Carla was there. I can't give her testimony. She needs to be present to give her testimony so that you can make a decision on whether you trust that testimony. 15 days prior, we're going to be making a meeting agenda and going through the minutes. You will, for virtual, this will be your link forever. So it is the city's website, greensboro-nc.gov/MSC meeting. So it is in the singular. There is no S on the end. And what you do is you simply click on this link and it's going to take you so you can register and it'll send you the link. Because registration for the meeting is required, I can't send you a direct link. And the reason that we do this is one of the precautions we have for Zoom bombing, where somebody can hack in and destroy the meeting. This is a precautionary measure that they have. We require registration for all meetings. 2 days prior. Now for Zoom, the staff delivers binders. So what you would do is you'd contact our office, Christy Holt. She's my administrative supervisor. Let her know the address that you want your binder to go to, any special instructions, back porch, under a shelter, wherever that may be. And they will deliver those on the second day before the Housing Commission meeting. Now, the binders will be picked up on the day after 10 a.m. So if you could possibly leave it back in the same spot. Now, if you'll just simply communicate with Christy, then we get, I think Brian Sims works for Roddy. Brian does the deliveries and does the pickup so that we don't have any confusion. Same person's doing same instructions. And the reason we do the binders for new commissioners that haven't seen a binder yet is that each case on the binder has an agenda item. And we go ahead and we put the cases in so that you can easily flip to case number 6, case number 8, and back and forth. Because otherwise, you're flipping through a whole bunch of pages this thick, and you're trying to find, well, where's this case at? So we do this for you so you can easily get to your cases faster. Anything in the binder on the case information that you want to keep, pull it from the binder, but leave the tabs and leave everything else in the binder so that we can refill it. If you don't keep anything, we're going to destroy it when we receive it back, and then we'll replace the binders and everything when we get it back. We do sanitize when they're picked up, and you're welcome to do the same. When we deliver, wipe it down, spray it when you receive it, and then when we pick it up, we're going to do the same, so that you always have a clean binder when you get it back. Meeting day, meeting starts at 1:30. If you're able to get on at 1:15. You can log on. You don't have to sit there for 15 minutes, but if you can just simply sign in, make sure everything works. And what will happen is at the very beginning of the meeting, I try to add commissioners first. The reason that is because on all of your screens, if I can add all of y'all first, all of you are going to be at the top. If I don't add all of y'all first and add everybody at the same time, then you're not going to see everybody unless I pin everybody to the screen to where you're all up top. Okay. The cases that you hear that will come to you, there are 3 situations. Appeals, any decision of an inspector regarding violations of the housing code or the existence of a nuisance. If an inspector interprets the ordinance and says, hey, this is a violation, the citizen does not agree, they have a time period to appeal, and that's coming to you. And then what you're doing is you're looking through the eyes of the inspector. What information did you consider to make this decision? And if they have evidence for them to consider to make that decision, and you believe that yes, that matches what the ordinance is, because they're going to have to show you the ordinance. They're going to say, this is the ordinance, this is my evidence, I made this decision, and then you'll hear the rebuttal from the citizen. Well, what is your evidence? Do you have something that shows a different picture? And then if it is an interpretation, you would make that interpretation, or you would make that decision based on the facts that that was presented. You also can hear an appeal of a civil penalty reduction. All right. So a civil penalty reduction is available $1 for $1 for all civil penalties assessed in a housing case. All right. The privilege of that reduction is given in the ordinance to the Director of Neighborhood Development or their designee or the city attorney. I've been the designee. I've not been set that I'm still the designee. But I think the reason that I've always, my position has been set at the designee is so that you appeal my decision and the director can always review that work. So if the citizen, if the citizen says, hey, I don't think you gave me the most reduction that I can get, and if that is the case, then they can appeal to you to make sure that I followed the policy. And then you're gonna look at the policy, you're gonna look at the evidence that we're gonna display for you or give to you, and you look, policy, evidence, okay, yes, it looks like it was followed, and then you'll hear the appellant. What is your grievance about this? And then you'll make a decision as to, okay, well, staff, we see that staff followed the policy, so we're gonna agree to support. Request for ordinance. That's the second reason that a case would come to you. Now, this is to effectuate the inspector's order to repair or the demolition by the city. Now, what this means is that, say there's a house at 1234 Main Street. And this house, the city, I have funding because I do the demolition. I have funding in my budget that's appropriated. This is a dangerous house for the community. We got to get this house down. Then I'm going to track that house onto the commission. All right. And then we're going to present our evidence to you, and we're going to tell you, all right, this house here is dangerous to the community. There's children in this area, and I need to take it down, and I need your ordinance to do so. So that is what's called to effectuate inspector's order, and I have the funds appropriations ready to go. When you do the ordinance, I have to wait 30 days to allow the person to appeal. Once the appeal period is gone, then I'm allowed to effectuate that ordinance by either demolishing or repairing. The second reason for requesting an ordinance is a summary ejectment of an occupant to protect their life, health, and safety. If an inspector deems a structure is unsafe to occupy or to be in the structure, and we've ordered the structure vacant, and we found safe housing, because we're not going to kick anybody out of their house until we find them a safe place to go. And we work with our community partners, with the Housing Coalition, with Greensboro Urban Ministries, with the Salvation Army, and their partners. We will find them a place to go, then make that connection before we order them out of that house. But once we've ordered them out to protect their life and they don't leave, that's when a summary ejectment order is required. If they refuse to leave an unsafe environment, then we're going to calendar onto your next regular meeting a summary ejectment order request. And we may put, no, we won't effectuate together. We would just be asking a summary ejectment. And what we're going to do is we're going to request that ordinance, and we're going to show you the evidence of why we think this structure is dangerous, and why we need to remove this person. Now, once you adopt that ordinance and says, yes, we agree, this person does not need to stay in this house because it is dangerous, then you would vote to issue a summary ejectment. We would then take that ordinance, and at that time, we gain the powers similar to that of an owner that is ejecting a tenant. We would have to go to the magistrate and get an ejectment order and have the sheriff actually eject the person out of the house. And then once we do so, then we will board and secure the structure.
I'm hoping this is a good question for the commissioners, but I'm also curious. If we ever bring an ordinance asking for summary ejectment, would we ever do so without any possible placement for that family?
No. No, that's what I said earlier. We will have a safe place to move them to, because we don't want to eject them and them not have a place to go, because we're not going to create homelessness.
And then the other thing, two areas from particular, we don't expect a general role of the commission, not to all, because it is to make sure that all is written and particular that is qualified. It was not an expectation, I think it's important for y'all to know and understand that. No expectation to be experts on everything. That's why we have professionals to do that. Your job is to make sure that the particular policy is followed and understood. What they can say that with the oversight, and that code was applied with. Different conversation that we all, I think, whether it be the experience or you're being received with information as human beings, sometimes it could be. That's not the role, right? Like the role is.
So the third reason is receivership. So the receivership is new. This was an authorization by city council to help resolve cases that, where ordinances are adopted for repair. Prior to the receivership bill that the state legislature gave cities authority to do, prior to that, you could adopt an ordinance. City goes onto the property, starts making repairs, and then the owner says, get off my property. Well, the job's not done. So the city has put $10,000 worth of work into this house. The owner just told us to get off the property. We have no right to remain on the property. So now we're gone, we're out of $10,000 too. So the only thing we can do now is put a lien on the property and the violations are not actually satisfied. So then the state legislature wrote a bill and they called it the Receivership Bill. That was in 2018. In 2019 is when the city council, 2019 or 2020? The city council, 2020? Okay, so the city council adopted the receivership program, and what they done is the power to solicit or to petition the Superior Court rests with the governing body. But just as the powers you have to create these ordinances, the city council bestowed this power to you as a body, allowing you to say, yes, this case here is appropriate for receivership, and yes, you have the authority by this ordinance to petition Superior Court to assign a receiver or a qualified receiver. Now, in neighborhood development, we've created a process, and we've created, based upon the general statute, we solicited qualified receivers. So we put out a RFQ, request for qualifications. We put out all the steps of the general statute, all the financial qualifications, everything that the statute says that the judge must consider for qualification for a qualified receiver. We put that in the packet. Then we accept those bids. Once we accept those bids, we look in the packet, we make sure everything's there, everything's good to go, and then they move over and they're on our qualified list. Right now, we have 4 qualified receivers. All 4 are certified MBE businesses that have that certification. So we have an MWBE office for minority business enterprise and women business enterprise. So it's great that our qualified receivers that we have is 100% MBEs. Now, what this practice is, what you're going to see here is if we bring a case to you that we want to effectuate the repair, plus we want to petition the court for a qualified receiver, we're going to be asking for 2 ordinances. And first, we're going to have to get you to uphold the inspector. And if you agree with the inspector and you uphold that decision and create that ordinance, in the same action, once the finding of facts is done here, we're going to ask you for permission to petition the court. We may put the 2 together, we may keep them separate. That's all strategy and that's all paperwork for us, and that's with what legal tells us to do, because this is appealable.
Because I want to, it's important that you understand that, and I know they're calling it, bring it out.
Very, very high level, and the only reason I'm saying high level is, it looks great on paper. The challenge of receivership is where you find a developer that's willing to come in, renovate the property, fix it, and the developer can either rent the property, get the money back, their cost, or the developer can put the property out for bid. And I'm grossly paraphrasing the statute. They can put the property out for bid to recover their costs. The owner can bid on the property to basically buy it back from the receivership and pay the developer. If the owner could get that financing, probably wouldn't be in receivership. But once the house is renovated, they may be able to get financing to buy the receiver out, and then they own the property, and they have a debt with the commercial lender that they pay off. If they can't buy it out, and the property is sold, the receivers pay the owner, I think it's the surplus fund, but someone else lives in the house.
The short version,
If I can interrupt just a second. When you talk, if you walk over, Tony in the other office is watching and she can't hear. She said whoever's talking in the district can't hear.
it essentially, the short version is receivership is another housing preservation measure, right? It's a way to ensure that that unit doesn't go offline, that we don't lose that as housing stock within our community, and that it gets remediated in the most appropriate way that we can.
It's a financing tool. The challenge is to find a property that has, financially it works, where the receiver wants to repair, the receiver can get paid, and that we're not guaranteeing someone's gonna lose their house. So there's a balance there, and part of that is staff looking for the property that fits. And then, of course, the commission approving that that property fits, and that it's not gonna be a permanent measure that we're guaranteed to put someone out of. So there's the balance, and you're a check and balance, and then the Superior Court is a check and balance of the property. Sorry? I believe if the house is sold, the receiver gets paid, taxing gets paid, assessments get paid. If there's anything left, I believe that goes to them. So, in theory, yeah, it's tough. But again, it is a program that it may not necessarily be designed to keep that property owner in the house, but it is designed to keep the house available for affordable housing. And the receivers are selected, and they understand that if they sell the house, it's conditional for whom the house is sold, so that it's an appropriate income level, so that we're not raising the bar for that neighborhood and in effect moving folks out of the neighborhood. Another concern that it's also one of the challenges of the program, but again, that's why you're a check, and that's why the Superior Court is.
And to say, and to you all, if you think about receivership, or you really think about any of these things, minimum housing commissioners just don't have constituents, right? You have cases. Your job is the stabilization of our housing stock, right? That's what you're here for. And so the depersonalization of this process becomes really important, because when you talk about something like receivership, it's easy to get believed. What about that property? What's going to happen with this and down the line? It's about the stabilization and preservation of those units of affordable housing. So keep in mind your role is housing stock.
And I would add, and I'm normally talk about this again later, but one thing Michelle just said, you don't have constituents. And you don't. When you sit in your role as a quasi-judicial board, you don't represent a specific district. As an advisory board member, you may, but as a quasi-judicial board member, you don't have constituents that you represent. And so if the house is in your district, there's no greater weight given to your vote than if it wasn't in your district. But your job is not to protect voters for the sake of your council person, but as Michelle said, your job is to help stabilize housing and preserve housing that is available to the general public.
And one of the biggest things with that, and we may pull it off of your case information, is to protect you from this argument that he just that Tony just mentioned, is you shouldn't know which district the property's in that's being presented to you. The reason you shouldn't know which district is from, you might treat it differently. And that's where once we've talked it out and thought about it, is we as staff can accidentally create a bias for you. Because when you're looking at the case, say you represent your council person appointed you as District 2. All right, and you're adamant, I'm not voting or upholding any decision in District 2. That's a bias. That could be a negative bias, because if the structure in that district is unsafe or needs to be done, you have made a decision prior to walking into that room, and that's one of the things that you have to be careful not to do. Is you cannot have a predisposed or predetermined decision before sitting down to hear the case. You have the information and you gotta look at it. You can look at the packet that we send you, and yes, you can be like, okay, and it's just like the planning and zoning board. They get the packet, they read the case, they see what the developer's gonna tell them, and they can look at it, and they can say, yeah, that's probably good for the city, only because they have in the back of their mind what the city's comprehensive plan says. But when you sit down, you can't come in and say, I'm voting this down. I'm voting this down. And please, if you do have that, don't tell nobody. Because you have aired your bias until you get into your meeting. When the hearing starts, now you're with commissioners. Now you have questions, you have questions, and then when you get into deliberation, which means staff is through giving their evidence, the appellate or the applicant, the other person is through rebutting against whatever the inspector has provided. Now you're into your full deliberation. And when you're in full deliberation, Q&A kind of goes away from the applicant. You can ask them questions, but they should not get your attention and start interrupting your deliberation. Their time to speak is now over. So you always have the right to ask a further question from your deliberation. You can ask the inspector, you can ask the other person, but you should not let the other person should not be interrupting that. And that's what your chair controls. Because otherwise you'll have what we had at the last meeting and it goes forever. Because what's happening is the other person that is appealing, the appellant, is going to always keep chiming in, hoping to keep chiming in, trying to get their case reversed or something else, and you'll never finish. You'll never get to a vote. So that's once you get into your deliberation and your discussion. Once you're done, then your chair will usually ask you for a vote. Now, back to the receivership. One of the key things for you to always to know is you'll never get a case that comes to you for effectuation or anything else is always a vacant structure. They're never occupied because these are condemned structures that we're bringing to you. The only situation, and it's very rare, I don't know that we've seen any yet, is an appeal. Or an ejectment. If an inspector issues a 48-hour notice, a danger notice, and the person will not get out of the house, and it is a danger, no water, no heat, no electricity to the home, and they won't get out of the house, and they can appeal that decision for condemnation, that's the only time that you'll receive a case with a person in it, and that is an appeal. And then you would make a decision with that occupant present. But all of your other cases, there's no cases that you'll ever get where there's not a tenant in it. Because we will have already taken all the enforcement actions to have the tenant removed by way of coming and asking for a summary ejectment order or something else. But so far, what we found is people don't want to live in this bad situation. They want a safer place to stay. So when our partners put them in a hotel until we can get more permanent supportive housing for them, they'll get out of the house voluntarily, and then we'll secure the house until we continue our work with the owner.
And no one understands more than us, this is a very emotional thing to the person who lives in that home, right? Whether your home is safe or not safe, it's your home. And so that is not lost on our staff, not lost on Tony and his folks. We understand the sensitivity as it relates to that. We are working, as Troy has explained, with partners to make sure that an appropriate housing placement has been made, that folks are being given the resources that they need. But to be clear, at the point at which that comes to you, it is a life-threatening or an extreme health safety circumstance. These are not things that come to you for minimal issues. This is because the situation is dire. And so again, you're gonna hear me a lot today say, be personalized. And I've spent my career doing this. I understand how hard it is to hear people's stories. But when someone's life is in danger or the health of that person or their family is in danger, we have to err on the side of safety for those residents. And so keep in mind, you have to be personalized that part of it and understand that it's a health and safety
And we can always talk, if you have any more questions about receivership, just write them down. We can walk through it. That can almost be its own class. All right, appeal of building inspections. What you will have in the housing commission is you will also have the chief building inspector sitting in the room with us. So there are two areas of inspectors in the city. In engineering inspections, you have trades inspectors that do the building, electrical, mechanical, HVAC, regulatory work that is by the state, North Carolina State Building Code. That's one set of inspectors. They're also called a code enforcement officers by statute. The other side of the house is in neighborhood development is you have code compliance inspectors, which code compliance separates us. But in code compliance, you have public officers by city ordinance. So we're under a different oath of office and we enforce the codes of the city. But the housing code is the International Property Maintenance Code. Also in the good repair ordinance, when it was adopted, it also adopted the International Property Maintenance Code as its non-residential standard, but it has exceptions to it. So when you go into the ordinance in chapter 11, which is the housing ordinance, that's also where non-residential ordinance lives under 11-57. So if you want to look at the revisions of 11-57, those conditions do not apply to non-residential cases. So the inspector will do a full inspection of the structure, and then they'll go look at 11-57 and mark off any violations they found because 11-57 does not apply to a non-residential structure. We do not enforce those parts of the code. So the chief building inspector does condemn non-residential structures. Even though we have the power through the good repair ordinance to do so, we've allowed that to stay with the chief building inspector. So that's the reason he may bring a case to you for condemnation, and he's required to do so through state law. Now that's currently being reviewed by the city attorney's office to see whether or not the commission is the appropriate board to hear that. But for right now, I think it's still with us. So the MHC may uphold the inspector, require the repair or demolition within 90 days, which would require it within 90 days, continue the case to a later date based on the circumstances, or reverse the decision of the inspector. Now, when you hear a case, one of the things that you would really want to consider is if you're going to decide to continue the case, what is the reason that you're going to continue it? Because you don't want to have to hold the hearing again with all evidence being submitted again. Because remember, when appeal case goes to Superior Court, it takes this information and boxes it up and it goes with it. So is the reason that you're continuing it because we don't have our evidence together? Or is the reason you're continuing it because the appellate or the person that is answering the defendant, if they're answering it, that they don't have information and you've asked for something and that something is your decision based. That's something that needs to be clarified.
Another thing to keep in mind is that if the decision is made to uphold the inspector and require the repair, there's also a time that has already passed between that inspection, when that inspector cited that problem. What's that typically between the time and it hits when you have it?
It can be 90 days to 5 years.
So, but before the case gets then have to be first time?
Yeah, because the older cases are the older cases that never moved forward. Some of those are going through now and they're hearing 2015 and 2016 cases.
So all that to say, when a case is continued, there is likely there's been a short amount of time, but in some cases, there's been an extremely long amount of time that this case has already been going on and on and on, right? So that is another important distinction. There was an inspector out there yesterday, the case in front of you today. This person has had 0 time to discuss or address issues or cure any violations. So there's already been a lag time by the time it gets to minimum housing.
Yeah, one more. All right, so yeah, so there's three, and I'll cover it later. It'll come up because I do want to share that time, because there's the inspector's time, rehab time, and director extension time that all is opportunities for the person to gain compliance. And that's our efforts that we put forward. Your general format of a meeting is the chairman opens the meeting, calls it to order. You approve the prior meeting's minutes. The chair will ask, does staff have any amendments or any changes to the agenda? So there's two things going to happen there. We may have a case that we need to pull off for staff reason, which means if it's not legally eligible to be heard, we have to pull it off. We cannot let you hear it. So we may make that change. We won't make any additions on our behalf because we have to publish. So we will have already published 2 weeks prior any cases that are going to be heard. So we won't be adding cases. We will only be removing cases or letting you know, because it's virtual, the state statute for housing requires that we must have a consent for them to participate, for their case to be heard virtually. And that is a statement that legal counsel always asks before we can hear that case. If they do not consent to that virtual hearing, we cannot hear that case any further. We move it off and we put it back on whenever we get back together. You also can make additions to the agenda. The reason I said that we added a step at the very end for feedback or reflection is because what we've seen in the last 3 to 4 meetings is there's always been a request to add something at the very end of the meeting for discussion. So we're calling it reflection and feedback. So after you hear a case, if there's something that you want to reflect or some feedback you want to share with staff that will help you in your decision making for the future, that would be the most appropriate time. During the hearing is not the appropriate time. Right after the hearing is not the appropriate time. The reason that's not appropriate for both of those situations is because you're in the midst of hearings. So you're hearing a case, and if you share your bias or you share your feedback, reflection, staff should do this, staff should do that. When you do that in the hearing, what you're doing is you're setting up a problem for your next case you're probably going to be hearing. So instead, you hear the evidence, you do the deliberation based upon the evidence and what you've heard, then you make your decision. At the end of the meeting, give a reflection because that will be your next steps. Our next steps or what we would receive. Then you would hear your cases one right after the other, and what you've done is you've not created any problems or biases on your cases with the next person. Because if you share some feedback or reflection in one case, and the next case person is sitting there listening to you, and they'll be like, well, you done it for them, why don't you do it for me? Now you've created yourself a dilemma that you got to figure out, well, how is that situation different than this situation? And now that's what you're debating, rather than debating the evidence and the facts that's been presented to you. So we also have added a public comment period. The public comment period immediately follows before any hearings happen, so that the public wants to get on and wants to talk to you about affordable housing, rental rates, those things that are of your charge by your charter, then they can certainly get on and share that, and they do it early without waiting through all the cases. We follow the same format as city council. Person has 3 minutes to speak. Staff, right now, we haven't had any public talk, but if they do, we'll track it for 3 minutes and we'll let them know. That. One of the things that we're going to have to caution for, and we do read a statement, is that a person that has a case on for that day or a potential case coming up cannot talk in public comment about that case.
That's better.
That's pretty much it.
We want to make sure that if someone has a pending case, that they don't have an opportunity to somehow influence the commission at that public comment period. And we would encourage the commission not to have a Q&A during that 3 minutes. Hear them, listen. If you have questions, we can ask that person to stay for the full meeting, and at the end of the reflection period, we can have that Q&A. If you have directions for staff or council, either individually or as a commission, we can do that at the reflection. But so that we don't, again, as Troy said, create a bias on the record before you hear cases, listen to the comment, reserve comments, reserve questions. We get after the hearing, and then we can go through that process.
Yeah, yeah, that'll work. And if a person asks a question, don't feel compelled to answer, because the chairperson is probably gonna go ahead and say that, we're here to hear, we're just here to hear. We're not to answer questions in a public comment period. But if they want to wait to the end, then there may be a commissioner that will reflect or provide feedback at the end of the meeting, in that last agenda item. So then, appeals cases will always be first in the order that they are received. And then any request for ordinances will follow that. And then we will generally have, rescinding ordinances. So just as you can adopt an ordinance, we have to have a process to take that ordinance back, to rescind the ordinance. So we'll put cases on, and what that means is that we've got compliance with the property. The property is now in compliance, and there no longer needs to be an ordinance, and we have to get it unrecorded. So we have to formalize it. You don't have to hear nothing with those cases. It just says these cases are being rescinded. So once you pull them off, then we send them to legal, we pull them off the books and off the register of deeds or clerk of court. All right, so that gets us to the next section, which is a good time to take a break.
Yeah, we've been in the room since about 9:30. Let's take 10 minutes if we could. If that's all right with the commissioner, and then we'll come back.
Understand that we are live with Zoom. I don't know that anybody in the public is logged in. I think we're the only ones logged in, but it is recorded. So I would just give you that warning. If you want to have a conversation, not about business, no more than four commissioners standing together having a conversation. But if you do, you might want to do so outside the room, one-on-one.
You're welcome to have a social conversation.
Yes, but not about business.
Quick question. I'll drill that down as well. You bring a statement? You bring a statement?
I did, but Lisa does it front window.
Just on the record. And we will, I think truly. So where are you doing?
He was. Yeah.
Gonna get the timeline, and then that'll get us to lunch, and then I'll go through lunch. I would think we need to be on the month for 11:30. Give them enough time for questions.
It's done. It'll be 11:30. Now I have tea, water, box lunches. All right, so we'll start back. Are we missing anyone? All right.
And just housekeeping, lunch will be here about 11:15, which I'll probably start my presentation about 11:30. I'm not gonna eat, so I'm gonna let y'all eat, and we'll just keep rolling so we don't run out of time.
Very strict policy, you can't eat.
When lunch starts here, if you'll have them put it on that table in the back.
That's how you make lawyers shut up quickly, you hold food. So you can't eat food.
The little help.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll get started back. So we're gonna talk about how cases get to the commission just through the enforcement process. All right, so there are several different ways. Inspector can initiate if they have probable cause. Right now, they're not proactive. There's not enough staff to be proactive in the city. They're reactive, with generally 130 complaints a week being reported to the office. There's about 2,200 cases right now that's active, and about almost 900 of them are housing cases. We're having, I know last night, if you watched or got to attend the District 2 Town Hall meeting, I had given them some report on some numbers, and there is some apartment complexes that are really carrying a lot of our high numbers. We're working through getting plan of actions together for them before anything hits the media, like it has been in the past, and hopefully, we're doing a good job at that. But still, a lot of stuff is on the rise, and I think it's probably majority due to pandemic and landlords not doing some things with tenants, and vice versa, because if the landlord's not getting paid, they may not be doing something back and forth. So it's taken a while to get compliant. But the inspector from the outside of the building can see a broken window, peeling paint, a hole in the roof, rotten wood. Those are things they can see on the outside of the structure. If they don't have probable cause for the inspector in housing is more than 5 minor violations of the housing code or 1 major violation of the housing code. If that inspector does not have that, they cannot go any further unless they have a petition. And a petition sitting here on the bottom, a petition of 5 citizens, their signature and information. If you know of anyone that is part of a petition, the top name in that petition is the one that gets all the notices that everybody else gets. We don't have to give notices to everyone. The ordinance requires we give notice to the first name on that petition. If a petition is signed and turned in, the inspector must, whether they have probable cause or not, must try to do an interior inspection. And if they don't get consent, they'll pull an administrative inspection warrant and conduct the inspection based upon that petition. We also get referrals from the police, social services, fire department, animal control, a tenant, or anybody in the public. Any resident can report a violation to our office. Common violations, like I mentioned earlier, peeling paint, flaking paint, missing smoke detectors, unclean, unsanitary condition, electrical problems, broken heating and air system, and you have this list in your packets. And you also have an example of what the petition looks like. It only requires 1 government official or 5 citizens. This is the Ipmc code. The Ipmc code changes to the 2021 edition this year. Our ordinance is set up that it adopts the most current edition of the IPMC. So they update through ICC, which is International Code Council, every 3 years. So the 2021 is the new code. We're still operating on the 2018 now because 2021 has not been published. So we do the interior and exterior inspections and make determinations of minor and majors. So a person can call and say, I have moisture issues in my apartment, but do understand that if that's the only issue they have, when you have moisture issue in the apartment, you more than likely have a ventilation problem, you have damage to peeling paint or damage to the wall, you may have damage to the ceiling or to the floor, but that's 3 violations. So you have to have more than 5 separate violations that are minor in order for an inspector to even open an enforcement action, or 1 major. The inspection list is on your list. I'm gonna click through some of these because some of the timeline information is what I want to really get to for you. We have, for our purposes in enforcement, the inspectors manage their housing cases on a tier of level 1 through 4. Level 1 is investigation. Is there even a problem? Is there an administrative hearing that needs to be held? And the issuance of an order. Level 2 is performance period of the order. Level 3 is if it's been referred to the Housing Commission. And level 4 is an ordinance has been adopted and now it's on the list to be effectuated. So a civil penalty by ordinance is eligible after the order to repair expires. So at the end of the initial 30-day period, if the person has not done anything whatsoever, the inspector is allowed at that time to issue a civil penalty. Process, or what we're practicing, is the inspector is trying to gain compliance within 90 days. So at the very beginning, and what let me click the timeline. Let me see if I can answer that question when I get to that part. And it's in this slide that we're going to get there. All right, so I'm going to look over here because I can't read this on my screen. All right, so you have at the very beginning, you have the report of a violation. All right, so it came to the inspector's attention, and now they have to go out to actually see what's the problem. What is the problem? And they're going to have to decide, how do I get in the house? How do I see the problem based on what's reported? Do I have probable cause to go any further? If they do, they'll have the complaints issued and they'll issue notice of hearing. So between the first 2 steps, if they get out there and yes, they have probable cause, means they have more than 5 minor and they have a major and they have collected their evidence. So they have photos and they may have a video of the exterior of the property or the interior violations of the structure. So the second bubble is a complaint is going to be issued and a notice of hearing is going to be set. The inspector is going to invite the owner and the complainant or the tenant to what's called an administrative hearing. It is in City Hall, it's in the Melvin Building, and they will, the inspector will show the owner the pictures and say, hey, this is what I found on this during this visit. And they'll talk about all those violations. And the purpose of that conversation is that the owner knows what needs to be done. Now, sometimes all the owners don't show up all the time, but we try to get them there. We try our best because what we found is if we can get somebody sitting in the room with us, we're going to get compliance and we're going to get compliance faster. So just some of the techniques that we've changed in trying to facilitate that conversation has really went a long way. So then you have the third bubble is that inspector hearing. Now we have to hold it less than, that's no less than 10 days, but no more than 30 days out. So generally 25 days is when they're holding that administrative hearing. After that hearing, the inspector is going to issue an order to repair. It's going to be their decision letter. This is the first appeal opportunity that a person has to appeal the inspector's decision. So they're going to issue the order to repair or order to demolish. Now, the difference between which order the inspector is going to issue is whether or not on the financial scale of how much it will take to fix the repairs. Now remember, fixing minimal condition so that we can preserve affordable housing, fixing the minimum is not a turnkey fixing a perfect property. We're only fixing the minimum violations. That's all we're holding them accountable to. So once we get that price, if that price is less than 50% of the county's tax value, that the appraisal that's listed online, if it is less than 50%, then the inspector will issue an order to repair. If it is more than 50%, they will issue an order to demolish. And that is important because when it arrives to you for an ordinance, you can only adopt an ordinance of repair if it's less than 50% or demolish if it's more than 50%. And staff will provide that information to you. Now, if we also, at the same time, when we're having this administrative hearing, we provide the complaint or the property owner with brochures, and you have this in your packet, in brochures in the lead safe housing program and the rehab, the general rehab program. Okay. So this, as well as the department bulletin, the brochure that has the contact information is provided to them. In rehab, if they have maybe ADA requirements, maybe there's not railings on the front porch, maybe there's damage to the structure that they can't afford. Because remember, our purpose is to preserve affordable housing. As the compliance officer, which is also your purpose, is to preserve affordable housing. So when in the general rehab program, we have funding available such as CDBG funding, community development block grant. We have home funds. We also have a lead grant. If the structure was built prior to 1978, we're going to test it. If it's not already been tested, we're going to put it in the lead grant inspection cycle. The biggest reason what the lead grant does is protects the children that are less than 6 years old that live in the home. Even if a child less than 6 comes to that home 2 times a week, or if there's an expectant mother that lives in that home, we're going to test it for lead. And then if there is lead present, we're going to remediate it for lead. But general rehab, they may be eligible based on their income, and it benefits the occupant of an owner-occupied property, as well as it benefits the landlord if it's a tenant-occupied property. And some situations are income-based and some are not. Some are condition-based. But it's at that time, which as you can see, this is the first part of the whole process. It's that hearing that we have this discussion with this property owner. Now, in some of the hearing cases that you've had that has been channeled through to the commission, they've forgotten about some of the process because they're old cases. That process was done at the very beginning, and we're catching up on some of those cases to get an owner to fix the structure. If they appeal this order, they have 10 days. That's the next bubble. They have 10 days to appeal the inspector's order. They can do so in writing. I think the ordinance talks about they do so to the secretary of the commission, and it refers to the secretary being a staff. So essentially, I think the secretary and staff liaison is one and the same. Or at least 2 years ago when I came, that's what the director told me.
So we accept emails to Troy of the notice of appeal.
Yeah, so there's a process with the inspector that if any inspector, supervisor, or anybody in our department receives an appeal, it comes to me immediately, and then we have a process. And generally on that appeal, I give notification to the chair, we received an appeal, and it will be docketed on the next regular meeting. We wouldn't be calling special meetings for an appeal. The ordinance says the next regular meeting shall be heard. And again, if it's an appeal, we have to have consent to hold the virtual hearing. Obviously, right now, we know that we have cases where the person's like, if I don't consent for the virtual hearing, I've got endless continuances. Which means I don't have to comply. And that's the problem with one, they're not consenting to the virtual hearing. And that's the other issue with continuances. It is the enforcement action is stayed The inspector cannot do anything else. They cannot meet with them. They cannot write them no letters. They cannot visit their property. They can't do anything whatsoever once an appeal occurs. So that's the reason why when the appeal gets to the first regular meeting of the commission is for us we're going to give you the facts that inspector made based their decision. And you as the compliant, and with the same power as the compliance officer as the inspector, we want you to collectively say, we see what the inspector saw, we see what the ordinance says, yes, we support it. You made the right decision. Now, a distinction, you're going to hear two things in Tony's presentation, and we're trying to change our verbiage to avoid confusion. So you just heard me say the word support, right? In an appeal, when the inspector is going to show you, this is the evidence I considered, this is the ordinance that's violated. You look at it, yes, okay, all right, I support that. Yes, all right, now, and then you hear from the appellant, what do you have to rebuttal against this? If that doesn't change your mind, then your decision would be to support the inspector that, yes, this inspector has made that right decision. So you're voting to support it. Now, when you support it, it goes back to this process and it continues down the path. Because remember, the first 10 days of the process, this case is moving, but if they appeal within that 10, everything stops until you hear it. And if you support it, then it goes back. Now the inspector is back working with them through the remainder of the process. The other verbiage that you're going to hear is uphold. When the inspector has moved a case all the way through the process and you got to the end, and now the city is asking for an ordinance, now you're looking at it from a different view. Pretty much the same thing, but you're not necessarily paying attention to the beginning, because if they don't appeal, then the order stands. Now you're looking, do they still have more than 5 or 1 major violation remaining? If they do, and the inspector is asking for an order, then you would be adopting an ordinance to uphold the inspector's decision. So you hear support and you hear uphold. In an appeal case, if you hear the word uphold, my mind will go back to, am I adopting an ordinance or am I voting of support to the inspector? So we're going to try to, in our paperwork and our calendar, and when we talk, try to be communicating that this is an appeal case, so you'll be voting to support the inspector or not to support the inspector's initial decision. Uphold the inspector or not to uphold the inspector's order in order to adopt an ordinance. All right, so
We can have cheat sheets for that, really easily, because it can get confusing. So we can have those, we have it for the meetings, the other things, for the select, we talk about virtual meetings, we anticipate these back in person meetings in November. So that will help a lot,
all right. So then our next bubble is, you see the appeal at the very top. My mouse work up there? Right there. So you see the appeal here. So that is that appeal hearing. Now, if there is no appeal after 10 days, it moves straight on up the line here, extensions. So by ordinance, the inspector cannot give no more than 90 days from the issuance of the order. So the original order is 30, and they can give 2 extensions. 30 makes 90. Once the inspector has 90 days that has transpired and passed, the inspector's done. They can't give no more extensions. Their supervisor can't give no more extensions. I can't give no more extensions because the ordinance does not allow it. Instead, the ordinance has 2 other provisions. One is rehab. So in the program information that we already have at the very beginning, if the ordinance says that if they submit an application for rehab, if they have an approved application or approved application pending construction, or if they're in construction pending completion. If they're in any of those phases, we're going to give extensions of 60 to 90 days at a time. And we're going to check, make sure it's in rehab. because while the case is in rehab, the person that owns the property has no control of compliance. We have control of compliance only if we can control our contractor that's doing the work. If we can make them go faster, we have better control. But since the owner does not have control, they will not receive a civil penalty, and we will not be given any further in a punitive enforcement action while it's in rehab. So that's why the ordinance says we can give continuances, and it's endless until construction's complete. Then you have director extension. So if the case is denied rehab, or the case is completed, but now we're down to less than 20% of the structure or less than 25% of the structure is left to be repaired, then under a standing order that would be issued by the director, if these circumstances exist, then that supervisor and inspector is allowed to grant a director extension, which will be 90-day extension intervals. If you give a 30-day extension, 30 days is going to be on us before we get another extension. So giving a 30-day is not realistic. Inspectors are carrying about 200 of these housing cases. They're not going to be able to look at 200 houses in a 30-day period. So the extension period, because what we want to do is we hope that the first extension of the director gets us compliance. That's 90 days. If we don't, at the most, a second extension of the director, which will give us 180, we hope that will get us compliance. Now, if the director says, no, y'all, the inspector's done enough, we can't get compliance, or they're not doing anything, and I'll back up to answer your question earlier. At any point during the inspector's process, they can issue a civil penalty. If the person in the first 30 days, they ain't working, they'll give an extension. If the second 30 days, they ain't doing nothing, they've cut off all communication, then the inspector is going to issue a civil penalty. And that civil penalty is going to be $200 the first day and $10 every day thereafter.
It's from the book.
If it's a what?
Meaning if the homeowner is entered into, so if the homeowner is not in our rehab program, but the homeowner has hired someone. So if the homeowner has hired someone, they're to work on the property, that's where the inspector's extensions allow up to 90 days. If the homeowner contractor is still working, I'm guessing that your inspector would ask the director for an extension, would see progress, and that would be up to the director to grant that extension.
Yeah. So under the director, and this is one of the things that I've not finalized it with Michelle yet. But under the director extension, we're going to be listing the qualifications that would qualify for a director extension. So like if we're less than 25%, that's an objective standard. So not subjective. I don't want the inspectors using an opinion. It has to be objective. If this objective standard is met, then an extension can occur. If progress is being made, contractors on site, contractors working, we have a plan that the owners provided us in writing, whether it's scribbled on a piece of paper, it's just a plan, and they're moving forward with that plan, then that could qualify as a director extension. And if so, they will get extended every 90 days as long as that qualification is still present. If they stop working, if nothing's happening, they've cut off all communications, that's going to be a reason not to give a director extension because they won't meet that qualification. Yeah, and that's why we're going 90 days at a time. So when it happens, it can move 90 days. And obviously, even under the director extension, it's still going to have to keep going to compliance. Now, understand, they're still accumulating the civil penalty, right? So civil penalty is still going through this whole time. And so the contingency is still going, and unless we're ready to send this case to receivership or to demolish the structure, this case won't, or they appeal, it won't be coming to the commission, not for hearing or for a decision. So that keeps it on our side because as the enforcement officer, they need to keep staying in contact.
Right.
Let's get.
I know, obviously, we're talking through this, but like the goal from my perspective, is that we are very clear in the reasons that we will or will not receive inspection. There's a gray area, there's no somebody knows somebody, or I feel really bad for this person, or whatever it is. Again, it's like you, my charge is the protection and preservation of safety of normal health. So I'm looking at basic standards, and in the event that there's, for example, a contractor already on board. By the time that we get to talk about, there's a substantial amount of time that we have. I'm gonna wanna know what you've accomplished in that time. When did you engage that contract? If that contract was engaged the day before you showed up for this extension, that's a different animal than there was something, outside of control that happened. So things like that, while they to some degree have some subjectivity, the reality of it is, there's been a substantial amount of time put into that. If you were acting, if you're being good actors, then you would have to.
And we've got a lot of cases. The inspectors have tons of experience with deceit. Because, people are very deceitful, but the inspectors want compliance. Because our job is to preserve affordable housing. So that's what they want compliance. So that's what they're working toward. And we've got some very compassionate inspectors. Some that probably give way more extensions than the supervisors want them, but they do. They're working with them, and as long as they're moving forward, we give them time.
And a couple of things, so the rehab program has its own conditions to qualify that are outside of the housing code. If someone is denied, financial assistance in the rehab program, that is not a legal defense to civil penalties or to upholding the order or to asking for an order. And we've had folks come and say, well, I was denied rehab. Okay, that's not before you, and that decision cannot be appealed to you, and that denial has no bearing on your cases. If the director does not give an extension, if someone says, I wasn't getting any more extensions, and I should not have received these civil penalties, the director's extension is not an appealable issue. The denial of that is not a legal defense to issuing civil penalties. We have rejected standards. If that extension is denied, civil penalties begin. Then we're just dealing with the civil penalty reduction policy, but denial of that extension is not a defense to the civil penalties that were issued.
All right, so I'm gonna try to get through this flow chart here, and then we'll grab lunch. So right here, so you have your appeal, we have our extensions. Now, when we're done with extending, and more than likely what's gonna happen with the process referral, if the owners stop working on it, or if they issue civil penalties get them back to work. If they don't get back to work, and we're gonna make one of two decisions. If the structure is vacant, then we're gonna condemn it. And what that does is that makes sure that they can't advertise it to move somebody into a space that is not habitable. And it's also to make sure it gets done. When you have an investment property, or a tenant property, that landlord is going to do what they can do to get that condemnation removed. And that may put them back to work. That's the second level of enforcement. Civil penalty first, condemnation second, trying to get the home back to affordability, get it back repaired. Now, so this is where condemnation could occur. Progress has stopped and the house is vacant, or monthly reinspection fees will apply and the civil penalties will begin. If civil penalties have not begun before now, this is a process change, so this should not be here. This civil penalty should be in a box by itself, but obviously the paper is only so wide. Because a civil penalty is issued before condemnation, in an internal process before civil penalty was issued at condemnation. But now we're using, because the ordinance allows us to, we're using the civil penalty to motivate the person to get back to repairing the home. Instead of the condemnation right off, because we want to avoid displacement. And that's the purpose for the reversal. If I condemn a structure, family's gonna move out. When they've moved out, we're either overburdening our partners or we're contributing to homelessness. So that's why we pulled the civil penalty out and the inspectors are using the civil penalty first. If it gets them back to work, because we want the people to stay in the home during rehab or during construction. And then if conditions become unsafe, we'll find a safe place to move them to and we'll issue condemnation. And we'll go there.
To be clear, this is not intended to be punitive. This is intended to be a catalyst to get moving in the right direction, so that further penalties aren't incurred. And obviously, the thing that's gonna come up for y'all is, I can't afford to pay this. That goes back to Troy talking about, we have handed over the resource that is in the city's arsenal for support assistance programs. If you don't qualify for those, that is beyond our control. That has to do with criteria for qualification. But we haven't just handed somebody a civil penalty without doing everything within our power to put any resources that are available to them in front of us.
And just one clear, yeah.
Civil penalty stops the expiration of the rehab order. So if the inspector is in an order to rehab by a date certain, if the person is not qualified for extension under the objective standard for the inspector or the objective standard for the director, once that rehab order expires, then the property is eligible for civil penalties to be imposed. Again, because if there's no extension, that's a clear message, no work is being done. We need the first enforcement tool, which is civil penalties, to motivate progress. So that's going to be when your civil penalties kick in. Once that rehab order has expired and the extension has no longer been granted, and then that's the answer to that is because they haven't been making progress. Generally,
Right. Yep, it's right here. All right, so then you have, let's see, one of the things I missed earlier is right here. Let me back up. When the inspector issues an order to repair, order to demolish, we will wait the 10 days. If there is no appeal, then we're going to record a list pendings with the clerk of court. To put on notice anybody that is interested in purchasing that property, they're going to see that in a closing, in a title search, or in closing, and they're going to see that there's a legal action pending. We have to have, there is a transferee notification in the ordinance, and not everybody tells the seller does not tell the buyer, oh, by the way, there's a $10 a day penalty. The city's about to condemn it, or is going to condemn it, and gives them all the copies of paperwork. So instead, we're going to file that action, and we're going to file it at every stage of an appeal decision. So the order to repair, a list pendings would file there. If a notice of civil penalties issued, a list pendings will file there. If a notice of condemnation is issued, because that is appealable, it will file there. So they're going to have all the the documents so that we can have constructive service. That's what the ordinance requires. It says that if the next owner has constructive physical service of the documents, they are responsible. So if their attorney is closing in the purchase and they check, here's a list pendings, there's a notice, order violation, there's a notice of civil penalty, there's a condemnation notice, they are now served by way of that list pendings.
and let me be clear, the initial recording of a list pendants is notice. The overkill for the sake of the public is recording a list pendants at order to repair, recording a list pendants at notice of civil penalty. The list pendants at notice of civil penalty is not required as a matter of law. So that would not be a defense to, I shouldn't have to pay civil penalties because you didn't file a notice of list pendants at civil penalty. If we've got the list pendants at the order to repair, to demolish, that is sufficient notice for anyone down the line that may be subject to those civil penalties as well.
So then the second to last bubble is an ordinance period. if we are ready to effectuate an ordinance that we would be requesting, we're ready to demolish, or we're ready to refer it to the receivership, then this is the hearing where we will prepare the case and bring it to the commission to ask for an ordinance. The appeal hearing, the next thing that could occur here is the appeal of this reduction policy. All right, it's a civil penalty of the reduction policy. Now, in this reduction policy, basically what would happen is there's a couple different criteria. When a person has to have the property fully in compliance. There can be no violations outstanding. The inspector has to have checked it, signed off on it, we're good to go. Now we have a form that we've created, very simple form that helps the homeowner track, and it also lets them attach all receipts of all labor expenses to correct any violations of the ordinance. Now they will send us a list of the violations because it comes with every enforcement action. They get their updated list of violations. They will attach to it all receipts. Now the admin staff will go through and they'll verify that the violations of this case, that these are receipts to correct those violations. If you put in hardwood floors and you didn't get cited because you didn't get cited for flooring problems or holes in the floor or nothing like that, that's not eligible. The eligibility is dollar for dollar for all work done to fix violations cited by the inspector. So if all the violations refers to walls, roofs, exterior, but does not talk about the floors whatsoever, that is an extra. If there's no cabinetry, there are cabinets required, but if cabinets is not a cited violation and they went in and put all brand new cabinets, we're not supposed to give credit for that on the dollar for dollar. We reduce it down as far as $500, and then that's the lowest that the reduction can go. Now, the most recent change that Cindy Blue, as the interim director prior to Michelle becoming the director, she adjusted that policy, which is at the discretion of the director by ordinance. And what happened is there was two provisions added for the good faith purchaser. There was an appeal case that had came on, and an investor had purchased a property that was already accruing civil penalties. That investor fixed the property up in 172 days and was now going to have to pay $500 penalty because, remember, it can only be reduced down to $500. And he's like, what's the use of anybody coming into the city of Greensboro and buying any of our dilapidated properties only to pay a penalty if they fix it? So in looking at that for the good faith purchaser, if the property is subject to a order to repair, then they would have 120 days upon the day they purchase. If they purchase the property on this day in a closed recorded date, then they would have, and if they made all those repairs within that 120 days, then it gets wiped down to zero. If it is subject to an order to demolish, which is going to take a little longer because it's probably going to be tore up house worse, they get 180 days. So in the appeal case where that investor got a property that was subject to an order to demolish, fixed the property in 172 days, when we got that proof back and everything in, was able to make the reduction down to zero because it was less than 180. Now, in the most recent hearing, there was a citizen, and this is where we were talking about when you're talking about giving feedback and opinions in a hearing, it can affect the next hearing. That's what happened. That's what happened in this meeting. The discussion that was happening in this one affected the next one. So then what happened with the next one is the person that was appealing felt that they were being treated unfairly. They were like, well, there's a reduction. The director made a reduction opportunity for the first case, and theirs got reduced to zero. But here in my case, why didn't the director make a provision for me? I can't get mine reduced less than $500. And so the discussion, remember, this person's present, so they heard all of that talk. They heard all that discussion, and now they have their case. Now, but here's the thing, and I'll share with you, just as we shared the rationale of the director when they made that decision. Remember this timeline that we talked about here? That second case was a 2016 case. 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Through this whole process, that second case had 5 years to gain compliance. Going through rehab, going through extensions, and then going through disappearing and not having taken no action whatsoever. And the city has not moved forward for whatever reason. But that's a 5-year-old case. So what the interim director then looked at when they considered making this change was that the only person that didn't have time to fix the house was the good faith purchaser. Because the day that I now get the property, I don't have time to fix it without penalty. As opposed to, what we just talked about, extensions, 90 days, unlimited rehab, unlimited director extensions if they're making the effort. All of that, the owner of the property or the first person that got the penalty, got the eligible for the penalty, they got all that time. So they got, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, potentially, almost a year to fix the property. So that was the reason why you wouldn't give more time to the owner because they've had a plethora of time. And in this case, that particular case had 5 years. But I really felt bad that she felt that way, because she saw that, she heard that discussion, and she saw that investor got his penalties completely wiped away. But now that they're starting to work on the house, they got to pay $500 because that's all they're down to reduction. Even though they spent a lot more money, and I gave them a max reduction. That's how it came. So the only reason that the case came to the commission is do y'all agree that as the compliance officer, as you are the compliance officer, you have the compliance officer powers, did I follow that policy? If I did follow the policy, then you would support that. And then if they still wanted additional hearing from there, they have the right. Your support gives them the right to appeal it to Superior Court. And they can be heard on the Superior Court level. All right. Any questions about this timeline? If something comes up later, feel free to jot it down and bring it up. But this is probably a good time for us to run across the room and get us a sandwich.
So they are grouped by what kinds of sandwiches they are. Corey thought we were hungry, so we got canned food. There's tea, there's water, and different types of sandwiches. So grab some lunch, and then Tommy's gonna light in, because he can't eat.
Until he's done, he can't eat.
Victoria, if you'll leave that timeline up, Jeff, please grab your lunch, and then whenever y'all are back with your lunch, and I'll start on mine, and sorry, I asked you a question.
Give this to you.
You get my email?
Are we gonna take a 20 right at the end, and then,
He's gonna talk through lunch.
okay.
That's why he didn't have his meeting.
Okay.
You can like 5 minutes, right? She's wanting to go up to turn her reporters off.
I'm ready whenever everybody's seated and we're ready to go. Come on.
Okay, I will, I do.
Now, that is only for, yeah, that was only for minutes. You have to be within range of this laptop. Because earlier they couldn't hear over there, but whenever I fixed it, Tony had said that she could hear Michelle sitting there.
Could she hear me? Can you hear us?
Yeah, she said, me and you were saying, don't talk low.
No, yeah, not.
I don't even know if this is working, and I don't know how to test it. But she's monitoring us on the recording side to let me know if it's working or not. Huh? I mean, but that's the housing conference. Last week was unexpected. That was so wonderful. I've never been in clear water like that.
You don't mind if I start while you leave? So a couple points I want to make, and ask Troy to leave the timeline up here, and there's a couple points I want to make on the timeline. At the point that the inspector issues an order to repair or to demolish, the property owner is in charge of the property. Totally in their control. The city is not on the property directing them other than issuing this order to repair or to demolish. Until, if that order is appealed, until the appeal is heard, the lis pendens is not recorded. And I'm gonna say that now, and I'm gonna say it again in a little bit. But I want to emphasize that because the commission has in the past continued cases multiple times, if an appeal case is continued multiple times, that lis pendens is not recorded, the general public is not on notice that there is an ongoing action at this property, and an unsuspecting buyer may buy the property. So that is a big motivation that cases be continued sparingly. And we hear the case, if there's an issue with the order, we get that order before the commission directs staff. The staff may have to begin the process over, but if the order can be supported, then I almost said uphill. If the order can be supported, if the order be supported, that lis pendens filed, and then general public is on notice that there is an ongoing action with that property. It is not until the commission issues an ordinance that the city may have the ability to effectuate the change. And in the past, staff has brought to you requests for ordinances on properties where the staff is not ready to effectuate the change, either by budget or just logistics. With Troy's guidance, the change is that if the city brings to you an ordinance to repair or an ordinance to demolish, if it's ordinance to repair, that means that we either have the funds or a program to repair, or we intend to put it into receivership, or if it's to demolish, then the city has the funds and the intent to demolish the structure. And most likely it's going to be obvious when you see that house why the city would be making that move. And then, Troy, if you don't mind, y'all all had the handout. I want to leave that timeline up because we may come back to it. And that timeline, I think, is really critical to some of the questions about legal authority. So moving into the second part of this legal authority, and again, if you have questions, please stop me and ask as they come up. North Carolina is what's called a Dillon's Rule state. You don't need to remember that, there's no test. And what Dillon's Rule means is that city governments may not do anything unless enabled to do so by the state legislature. So the state legislature gives cities general police-making powers, and with that, cities can say, you may not shoot firearms in our city, you may not shoot bows and arrows within city limits. That's my example, because my 9-year-old asked me for a bow and arrow kit last night to shoot in the backyard, and my 3/4 acre lot was not going to do that. The city has that authority because the general legislature has given them that authority. The general legislature has given the city the authority to create a housing commission to facilitate affordable housing and as a review for inspector decisions. And the statutes are in your handout, and I'm not going to quote you the statute, but those are in there. Through that enabling legislation, the council has created the commission for two basic purposes. One is an advisory board to the council on rental rates, condemnation rates, and general affordable housing recommendations that you as a commission can study, can solicit feedback, public comment, evidence, not necessarily as a hearing, but you can hear, take evidence on affordable housing, and you may, as a commission, make recommendations to the council. If the commission wants to make a recommendation, the commission formulates that recommendation in a motion, it is seconded, it is voted upon, and then staff will deliver that formal recommendation to the council. As commission members and as citizens, you may always reach out to the full council at a public hearing, or to any council member, likely the one that appointed you, if you have recommendations or concerns. You always have that line of communication. The second critical role for the commission is to hear appeals of inspectors and to issue ordinances. And the big difference between those two roles is, one, you are wearing the hat of an advisory board. You have an opinion as professionals, you have an opinion as citizens, you have an opinion as folks concerned about affordable housing. When hearing an appeals or issuing ordinances, you are wearing the hat of a quasi-judicial board. In that quasi-judicial board, the key distinction is that your opinion as to what the council should do, or your opinion as to what the state legislature should do, is not relevant. The question is, do the facts presented match whatever policy or ordinance is controlling? And in that role, you are a compliance officer. You are ensuring that city staff has complied with the notice provisions that are required, that the appeal was heard within a certain period of time or received, that the inspector's hearing was heard within the appropriate period of time, that the inspector issued an order, and that the inspector's order, that the evidence the inspector received complies with the housing code violation, or if it's a civil penalty reduction appeal, that the reduction policy was complied with, that penalty was correctly calculated and then was correctly reduced pursuant to the terms of the policy. And I, for the new members, you may not have seen some of the past meetings, but I take a good bit of responsibility in some of the past meetings, not being very clear to say, we now have on our quasi-judicial board hat, this is a compliance hearing. This is not the reflection time. And with the chair's assistance and I know with Corey's assistance, I'm going to try and do a much better job going forward to say if we get outside of hearing a case to say, time out, great question, great comment, let's hold it, but let's first hear the evidence and make our findings of fact, whatever they may be, issue the ruling, take off that quasi-judicial board hat, put on the advisory board hat, and then we'll move into the reflection. Okay. And so that's going to take some practice for me, practice from the commission to make sure that we stay in the appropriate role at the appropriate time during the meeting. Quasi-judicial board, the biggest difference again between the legislative role and quasi-judicial roles, legislative board makes policy, quasi-judicial board follows policy.
Let me click up to catch up.
You click on
Which page you
31. And the tough thing is, and you will hear a lot of arguments, as some of you already heard, I know you'll hear it going forward. You can hear arguments that the law is not fair, the housing code is not fair, the policy is not fair. That is a question for the legislature. That is a question for Michelle potentially, if it's a policy within her that's been delegated to the director. That's a question for the city council. And we've had situations where the commission has said, can we continue a case and can we ask that that policy be revisited? And we did, we continued, it was revisited. And when it came back, the commission still was not happy. Commission members, I would say, were not happy with the revised policy. That conversation concern is for the reflection period. When we have on that quasi-judicial board hat, the question is, has the policy been complied with? And it's limited to, have we complied with the policy? We can then have further conversations during the reflection portion, again, about the wisdom of the policy, but that would not be held during the hearing. The appeals that you're going to receive, and we had a lot of conversations at the last meeting about this, and this, I do want to dig down. Tori, you put them on page 32 for me. So there are a couple of state statutes that control the commission's authority. And there's, by state statutes, I mean, there's a statute in 160D, which is the chapter of North Carolina General Statutes that controls land use regulation, and housing commission falls under that. Our charter, which is also state law, the city's charter is enacted by the state legislature, it can only be amended by the state legislature, is also state law, also has a provision that controls what the minimum standard housing commission can do. And the basic limit for the housing commission is that the housing commission stands in the shoes of a compliance officer. So your job is to act as supervisory compliance officer to whatever the inspector decision has been. There is a second part of our charter that says the commission shall have power in passing upon the appeals, and this is down here under the charter section, the second paragraph. In essence, where there are practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships, in the way of carrying out the strict letter of the housing code, to adapt the application of the code to the necessities of the case, to the end that the spirit of the code shall be observed, public safety and welfare secured, and substantial justice is done. Now, there's a lot in there, and I want to be very careful as we go over this. I want to go through it very carefully, give plenty of opportunity for discussion. The last hearing we had, the issue came up about the civil penalty reduction. The city attorney's office, my job is to advise you that the civil penalty reduction policy is not a part of the housing code, because the ordinance specifically delegates to the director to create that policy outside of the ordinance. So the interpretation is that the civil penalty reduction policy is not within this exception paragraph that allows you to adapt to the hardships and necessities. And if you look at the policy, the reduction policy, it very much already provides an adaptation to hardships by giving dollar for dollar reduction for any dollar spent on bringing the house into compliance down to a minimum of $500. Now, if the commission members or the commission as a whole does not believe that that policy goes far enough, that is a conversation during the reflection period with the director, who can take that into consideration, and the director may agree, may not agree. That would be up to the director, as is delegated by the council to the director. And I'm sure that Michelle, and the last time this issue came up, there were conversations with council members and with the city manager's office. And the current policy is a reduced version, but what was not taken out was the $500 minimum. That remains. If it continues to remain, then my advice to the commission is you don't have the authority to further adapt it, because that's not a part of the housing code. But so let's look at the rest of this exception. It gives you some grounds to adapt. And here's key in that paragraph. It says that you may, for practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships, you would need to make findings of fact to support what are practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships in light of a housing case. We know there are practical difficulties and hardships, otherwise the code violations would not be before you. There's clearly financial difficulties. With 99.99% of these cases, if they ever get to you, there's going to be significant financial hardship. So you would have to make findings of fact that these practical difficulties and unnecessary hardships are in some way different from other cases, but then you may not ignore, you may not usurp, you may not change, you may only adapt the application of the housing code to the facts before you. It is difficult to think of a case where you could possibly adapt the housing code to a case before you based upon these practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships. And the concern that the city attorney's office would have for you is that flexibility in one case or flexibility in 10 cases can set a precedent for the 11th case. And if that flexibility becomes the norm, when you get to the 11th case, for whatever reason, you don't apply that flexibility, potentially you can be setting the city up for an unequal protection claim, constitutional claim that you did this for 1 through 10, you're not doing it for 11. And if 11 appears to be someone who may be in a protected class, that sets the city up for a claim. So I would encourage you for that reason to use this sparingly. But this can also become a very slippery slope to your adaptation and flexibility is simply undercutting the housing code, the violations, and the enforcement provisions. And I tried to come up with a fact scenario, and I just may not be that creative, but I'd invite Chloe or Michelle, or even any of you to come up with a fact pattern that could be practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships of carrying out the strict letter of the code. And I don't know if we've heard one that where we could apply this provision. The provision is there. If it comes up in terms of a civil penalty reduction, I'll again remind you that that is outside of the code, and do not believe that it's subject to this paragraph. But other cases could be subject to this paragraph. But again, if it does come up, or if one of the commissioners wants to effectuate this paragraph for an adaptation, you're likely to hear the same warning that we need to be very careful, because the precedent may apply to other cases, and it should truly be a unique situation for the commission to consider.
If there is that, get help for the commission, usually you just kind of talk informally and say, yeah, this is going on. You may formally say, we are going to be finding this fact as to why this is difficult.
You would have to. Okay. And in fact, if you don't do that, you put the city in the embarrassing position of appealing your decision to the Superior Court. And no city wants to appeal the decision of their own board to Superior Court. And then, we all come out paying on this. So you have to make those findings back. And if you cannot make those findings back, if you cannot articulate them, then you don't qualify for that section. We have to be able to articulate those findings. And at some point, keep in mind, you may need to distinguish those findings from another case down the road.
It's-
The director is the decision to make the policy is delegated to the director. That policy is not stated in the housing code, the policy sits outside of the housing code.
You're talking about the civil penalty reduction policy.
Yeah, it's delegated to the director outside of the code. My interpretation, city attorney's office interpretation is that if that policy is delegated to the director and is not stated in the ordinance or in the code, then it's outside the code. So that would not qualify under this exception as far as adapting the housing code the strict letter of the housing code to the facts. And the other thing and again, at the last one, we go back to this last hearing we had. The last hearing really brought some teachable moments. It was a civil penalty reduction case, and the questions really were, did the person receive the notice of the civil penalty? And testimony was yes. There were questions about, was that notice sufficient? Those aren't questions for the board. The question is, was the notice sent? Was the notice received? Really, it's just, was the notice sent is the concern. Did the city give sufficient notice? And that is, did the city send that notice to the appropriate address on record? It is the property owner's responsibility to receive, but it's ours to send. Whether the notice was sufficient, constitutionally sufficient, that's a question for the Superior Court if the matter gets appealed. That's not a question for the compliance officer. The compliance officer, you're there to make sure that notice was sent, that the civil penalty was correctly calculated pursuant to the ordinance that calculates civil penalties, meaning, you know, if we had a civil penalty issue for 30 days, that's 200 plus 290, that's $490. So if we give you that time period for the civil penalty of $750, your job as compliance officer is to make sure we've correctly done the math. If we have a civil penalty of $2,000 and $3,000 of credible receipts applied to that work, we've only given a reduction to 1,000. That's your job to say you've not complied with the policy. The reduction should be to 500. During the hearing, arguments of don't think the policy is fair, don't think the policy is effective, we don't want to impose this policy on this person for whatever reason. That's not the quasi-judicial role. Your role there is compliance officer. Those conversations are for Michelle or council when we put that advisor hat back on.
And just to be clear, we still could add that agenda item, and we can send, you know, we want to discuss our thoughts on the $500. Calendar, stuff like that.
And for the sake of preserving the record, because again, Superior Court judge may hear this record, I would encourage you as commissioners, write down that note. And at the end of the hearing, when we've concluded that hearing, you've made findings of facts and you have ruled, then it's, Mr. Powell, please add this point to the agenda for the reflection period. And you make sure that we're not, you know, we got it, we'll double check to make sure we bring that back up. But let's finish that hearing before we open that. So the Superior Court judge doesn't read, clearly there's some disagreement. They just read the evidence, that's presented.
And some of the internal processes, like you just mentioned about how notice is sent, we wouldn't want commissioners to get tied down or bogged down with internal processes. Because the letters, even when we present evidence, the letters and everything submitted, we're following the state general statutes. I don't know that we're going to change that. If the statute says we have to do this, we're going to follow the statute irregardless. The only person that changes that is her, and the city manager tells me to do something different. And then he's going to tell them, I don't think that's advisable.
If the state statute says send notice by certified mail,
You got it.
we can do that. Now, could the council say, you know, we also want in-person service by deputy sheriff? The city council can tell staff to do that through an ordinance change. And so we can always raise the bar to get better due process. There's also additional costs, and you may not get that in-person service. But if that's the city council's direction, then we would have to comply with that. If the ordinance indicates, you know, if the ordinance mirrors the state statute and we have complied with that, your job is to make sure that we have complied with that requirement. But then at that point, for the quasi-judicial hearing, that conversation ends. We check that box and move on to the next box that we have to check, until we have, entirely presented the case.
Well, the issue is being doing it like that, and while that hearing is going on, that is the policy that is in place for that hearing.
Exactly.
You can talk about what you want to change or what you want to make different for the council, the policy that is in place during that hearing is the policy that you have to follow. If there are changes made after the fact, and, you know, next month we made additions or changes, that's a different animal, but you can't be making decisions based on policy that doesn't exist.
Exactly. And
also, they don't need to make sure they're making a decision on policy that policy change. They were served with the question was
well, the civil penalty reduction policy is a policy that's in effect when we issue the reduction. And the policy in effect when we issued the reduction was the $500 minimum. That was the policy that was presented, that was, which we were asking to apply the tax, in that case. Correct. So during the quasi-judicial hearing, and again, and I have to take responsibility of this because the last hearing, I really should have stepped up and said timeout. And Troy did at some point to his credit. So quasi-judicial hearing, obviously we want to make sure that notice has been sent, whatever notice is required for the hearing to be there, to come to here, to be heard before you. Folks may appear in person, they may appear through counsel. They don't have to appear. They can send their lawyer to appear on their behalf. Of course, the lawyer cannot testify for that person. The general process is that Mr. Powell will call the case, the chair will open the hearing, but at that point, staff presents the case to the commission. It's not an opportunity for the commission to question witnesses. It's an opportunity for staff to question witnesses and present the evidence for you. And that's either something that Mr. Powell will do or I will do with whatever witnesses that we want to present. We would ask the witness questions, present that evidence. The other party would have an opportunity to ask the city staff questions, even cross-examine if they want. The commission would have an opportunity to ask staff questions. That's not a time for argument, it's not a time for discussion, it's simply a time to gather evidence and ask questions. If there's some fact of which you're confused, ask the witness to clarify it, and we'll get that evidence for you. Once the city closes its case, we presented the evidence, the other party gets an opportunity to present the evidence. Again, staff has an opportunity to ask the other party questions, commission has an opportunity to ask the other party questions, but they may present their entire case. Once all evidence is presented, both sides will say have closed their cases, both sides may make a brief argument to the commission. And I would recommend that the chairperson would give them some time and hold them to it. At that point, you have closed evidence, closed arguments. The chair would then open deliberations. And the commission can then publicly deliberate on the facts. Again, you still have all your quasi-judicial hats. That is not a time to talk about policy, to talk about wisdom of the ordinance, wisdom of the policy, fairness of the application. It's a time to talk about does the evidence presented match the ordinance, or does the civil penalty reduction match the policy, or does the evidence match the housing code, and is it a violation of the housing code? Or does it not? Or does this house warrant demolition based upon the evidence presented, an ordinance for demolition, or does this house warrant an ordinance to effectuate repairs? That'll be the question before you. At some point, and I think we'll do a better job of helping you by giving you script or a motion that would uphold or support. But if the decision is to uphold or support, whichever way they go, then the staff would like to present to you proposed findings of fact. And those findings of fact would be that this notice of civil penalty was issued on X date, that the civil penalties began running, that they were calculated this amount, that we received these receipts, there was a reduction. We'll basically give you a script and submit that to commission to adopt those findings as your findings of fact. Of course, you may discuss those, you may make edits of those as a commission, and someone may make a motion to adopt the findings of fact. If there are tweaks, you can adopt them as presented, or you can adopt them with additional findings made. If those are accepted, those become the findings of fact. That hearing is closed. If that's your last hearing, we take that quasi-judicial hat off. We put the advisor hat back on, and if there's any reflections or comments, you make those reflections or comments to staff, and those may get translated up to council. If you want to make a recommendation directly to council, you would make a motion, put the recommendation on the table. If the commission upholds that recommendation, then staff will translate that recommendation to council. But at that point, you're as advisory board, those professional opinions come into effect, and you're no longer acting as compliance officer.
One of the things to also keep in mind, and I know we've talked about it, I don't know if we've talked about it as a group here. One of the things that you can easily get caught up in, especially when you're really passionate, I know a lot of things when I'm, passionate about helping others and especially improving the community, is understand that your role is not to save the property owner. The owner is going to be emotional because they got a penalty. They're going to be emotional because they're facing a code enforcement process. That's going to happen. That's inevitable. We deal with these with those situations in that case all the time. But that's not your role to protect them from the ramifications that they put themselves in. Because the timeline that we shared with you earlier, you can see the process. And just as I had in the last meeting offered to Commissioner Scott, that if he wants to have input on our letters, I'll welcome the input. And because it was successful with two other commissioners, with the creation of the courtesy letter that was from scratch. I don't mind it. I still have to run it through legal to make sure it's binding and everything else. But if the letter if what's written in the letter is a holdup, absolutely, I'll look at the letter. Not as in the commission together, we should not, hold our time like that. But I will definitely work with you offline and craft that. But just understand, when the case gets to you, they're gonna want you to save them. Save me from him. That is giving me a $500 fine, save me. And that's what, and passion and emotion will get you caught up in it. And then that's where you're like, I know it's pandemic, I really don't want this, this person to have to get that, and that's where you get stuck. And that's what we see. And when you're stuck there, that's where you can't make a decision.
Well, and again, I'll say it over and over. Your role in this is the protection and preservation of affordable housing. And in fairness to all of you, because y'all know me in this role, I haven't been in this role, my first commission meeting that I've been to plenty, and we've seen a lot of how it all goes down. And not, but, understanding of, I understood it like chocolate would be pulled out of your children who live in some figured out. I have walked into houses, doing spaces, and there was literally no space to put your hand that there wasn't right on. You understand the emotion and the pain and the experience that people are having in this situation, whether that's a tenant or a property, right? Whether that's a renter or whatever the circumstance is. At the end of the day, the health and safety of our community is what is at stake. Having homes that are habitable and safe, if it helps to think of it this way, is essentially a public health issue. If people are living in unstable or unsanitary or sick housing, it creates problems not just for that home, but for the children home in a number of ways, for that neighborhood in a number of ways. There are ripple effects of stabilized housing. And they're well beyond the people that happen to be living in it. That's the deal. That's what you're looking at. Right? Is this an environment where the child lives in their home? They are going to be able to learn without having lead or mold or something into their health. Is this a home where there are pest infestations that are impacting their neighbors on both sides and it's never been addressed? All those things matter. And it's just about who everybody finds that home in that particular home. Very deep and far-reaching things. I'll share with all of you that folks that go out to do this, and I'll work with Roddy and Carlos to chime in on this. They're physically there. They're walking into the units. They are seeing the conditions of stuff in the city. Especially when I say no one knows what is neighbors, the dangers and the risks that are present when a case has gotten to you. It's not like a lot of times, right? So those things are really good. It will always be about people, right? But think about it being about people that instead of walking back from shelter, whatever, there's our common street, needs to do whatever it needs to do. The decisions you make about that unit impact so much more than just that unit. Standards and capacity is what our code is. Those codes exist. Those are the health and safety things. That's their minutes, right? And that's part of my and we were just together under hand. But it's not something you take lightly in your role. This conversation is difficult. Meeting people on some of those difficult times in their lives, when Robbie and Carlos goes throughout the students. And they know that. And we are not here to be a punitive group of people that are trying to like just make it hard. Make it right. Allow the resources to be a resource. And that's their whole role when they cross the threshold. And if we aren't working in tandem and the commission isn't following the standards of what Quasi-Judicial Board is doing here, then I would say that we're doing harm. And that's capable.
And there was a reason I really wanted Troy to focus, as we prepared this presentation, really wanted to focus on the timeline, is because I think the timeline helps y'all, and I think there's perspective from the commission, in that if you're receiving an appeal of an order to repair or order to demolish, your decision is not so draconian that the person must go repair that home. They have at least 90 days of inspector's extensions to get that done before civil penalties may begin, if they're making progress and working with the inspector. They then have potential director extensions if they're making progress before civil penalties even begin, but they're still in control of the property. What you're doing is getting notice in the chain of title that there's an order, an ongoing case, and you're starting that enforcement process so that staff can work with the property owner and try and gain that compliance. If we're asking you to issue an ordinance, much bigger issue, because then we're asking for permission to go on the property and effectuate either demolition or repair. But I can promise you that the property you're gonna see for that ordinance could be pretty obvious. I'll be surprised if it's not obvious, especially if it's demolition. If it is repair and receivership, then a number of things have happened. And I think what may help, and I would suggest this to Troy and Michelle, is there are a lot of questions that come up at hearings about the rehab program. And I don't know if rehab's ever come and spoke to the commission to kind of set out the conditions of rehab and how someone must qualify for the rehab loan.
Yeah, so, people are, living now, we always call it the quasi-judicial part, being a county commissioner, and there's never really any time to be advisory role, right? And that's a problem, that that's half your charge. The other half of your charge has to do with the recommendations of practices of. Interesting, with you in talking about how we can concentrate on for those advisory, right? And I think part of that, for things like this kind of place, you need to have coming into those moments, those your understanding of where clear understanding that all programs that are available for us, for a number of other things, water, department, like all of those things, so that you understand how robust the services are that are available to you. But I don't want you to get positioned, and it's my responsibility to ensure that you're not, that only in the quasi-judicial portion of this and never gets an opportunity to be an advisory role. So that is certainly a priority for me and something that I'll be looking to make more robust for us in the body. Because I honestly think that's sometimes all you ever have is you never have that case after case after case after case, and then after and then you're on the case. Here, this is moment. This bill is your needs and is better staying in the framework of how meetings and quasi-judicial portion and hearings should go.
Would it be possible for us to get time cheat sheet for the parents?
I think I'd recommend presenting a cheat sheet, but also that we have the appropriate staff come in and give you the 30,000 foot elevation, because
It's built into this program. Sonia's supposed to be here. She's sick. She's been sick the last 2 days, so she's supposed to be here telling you about the program. We'll set it up.
We'd have a presentation. Did you have a question, Mr. Singleton? Oh, okay, for sure. The reason I think it's important to have that training to understand is so that when you get a case to come before you, and the property owner at ordinance to demolish says, or repair says, I didn't qualify for the rehab, they threw me out of it. Well, I couldn't get the loan, that you're not looking at us and going, well, why not? Well, there's in general a couple reasons. Either they made too much money, or they had too many outstanding liens or deeds of trust on the property. They put themselves in a position where they don't qualify. There's very objective standards as to why they would not qualify. And it could be a landlord that's done the same thing. It could be a landlord that simply cannot afford to maintain this property. It could be a homeowner that simply cannot afford to maintain this property in a safe condition. Those are very tough decisions to make for the property owner, but sometimes those are the circumstances based upon the code and based upon state law. And again, that's where we have to take off, we have to depersonalize the decision and look at what is the ordinance, what is the code, what is the welfare of whoever's gonna live in this house, and how do we preserve safe, affordable housing for the community. Did I see a hand in front of mine?
So many cases where, when I first came on. Lots of people use
A lot of those cases that y'all had heard, the previous director had us to push cases. I think what had happened was commissioners had reached out to their council person, said, hey, we're not getting new cases. Then the director's like, what do you have? I done an assessment, because like I said, I was brand new, evaluated our housing cases and saw that we've got like 500 and some that nothing's happening on them. We can send them. But that was before Jasmine and Tony, we really started looking in, because remember we had one city attorney going out of the office, so, which was Ms. Jones. So we lost some institutional knowledge there. So when we're looking and reevaluating the ordinance, okay, so we saw this is supposed to happen, but before that happened, we pushed 120 cases to the commission at that request. And when we did, what you received was 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017 cases where these programs may not have existed or been really advertised or matched in with code back then. Because when I came here in June of 2019, that's when the previous director, myself, was pushing rehab. Like, why are these not merging? Our cases are prospects. These are the people that need these services. So you can advertise all day long for rehab and lead. We need to marry these two together because these have the needs. That's when we started pushing the education and pushing the awareness. So you're right. The 2014, 15, 16 cases that kept coming up knew nothing about them. Because back then, when they were going through this process, they did not have that knowledge of that program. But all the cases that you have now, they all have it because we follow this process. And that's what we was hoping that, don't, certainly under the advisory function, let us know what it is that you're seeing in the process that would help you make your decision, or that's hurting you in making a decision. And we'll look at the internal process. But rest assured, a case ain't gonna come to you unless we have vetted that process. These supervisors are gonna check first, then my admin staff is gonna check, and we're gonna check the boxes. And then Aaron, which sits in the back of the room, is gonna come over and look at service on these enforcement cases before the case is gonna arrive to you. So when you get it, know that it's been checked, double checked, triple checked 3 times to make sure service, because otherwise putting it in front of you is to get an ordinance. And if you got an ordinance, we gotta make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. So that's what all happens. That's why it's not so simple, to move a case only 1 month down the road. We do a lot of work in preparation of that case file.
At the same time, you can't make that assumption. We need to present that evidence to you that we have.
And you need to see it, yes.
We comply with the due process requirements, the notice requirements. We check those boxes before you issue an order.
And it might make us change the fact sheet. We might change the fact sheet to comply with this because I want to make sure the box is checked. And I don't want to be dependent upon, well, is the form attached? No, I want to know the date, because that's what Tony's mentioning. We done this on this date. We done this on this date. That's going to be our check and balance that, yes, it's there and we got evidence to prove it. Here it is. So we may be adding a back part to our fact sheet.
And
the other thing is, numbers, everything else. I don't think we have to do that. You'll see that the majority of our cases become work, that's why part of it. And that, this is where it's related.
I think it's a good turning point. Now, I think in that given hearing, we're not going to go into why they reject it, because at that point, it's not a legal defense. But I think it'd be great for the commission to better understand, what the qualifications, so that when you hear I was rejected, you'll know it's gonna be for one of probably three reasons.
In one of your cases, and 2 points, just to point out, one, everybody that comes before you is not gonna be truthful. Y'all saw that in the last hearing, where both of them said, we ain't never got a notice, we ain't never got anything at all, and then what I put on the screen? The notice. They're like, well, right there it is, and it's dated, that, oh yeah, and they're like, oh yeah, that notice, oh yeah, we got that one. They're not, so they're gonna look after their own interest. The second part, tell me what the second part was, pertaining to what you were just saying. Yes. Yes, so one of your cases, I think 2 hearings ago, I'm not gonna say the name because it's being recorded, but in one of your cases, y'all may remember 4 adults living in a home. And one of the inspectors had condemned that they were gonna have to move out to a hotel. One of our community partners put them up in a hotel, or had made arrangements for them so that we could get the stuff done in the home. They did not qualify for rehab because they had $9,500 of monthly income. And we have a lot of these cases to where they'd be like, all right, hey, I want to apply for the rehab program. Well, they apply for the rehab program. The rehab program, the main part of it is income based. And it is focused on income. If you're getting $9,500 a month, you don't need CDBG funding from HUD that has restrictions that's listed for income, because you have enough money. If I had $9,500 a month, I can fix a bathroom. And what happened is, you saw them, they got backed into the corner. They didn't want to go live in a hotel. They fixed their bathroom in a week and a half, case was closed. And there's other cases just like that. And one of the things that we're going to also try to add to the packet is, when a denial occurs, we want the letter. And since rehab is in my division, it's an easy fix. I want the approval letter, I want the denial letter, I want it in the packet, so then you can see. You'll see which criteria was used for the denial.
We have also had. And that may not always be information that you use, but that is certainly also something that happens. Just because someone qualifies doesn't mean they have to sign on, and they have to actually do it. So if Troy applies for one of those persons, then everything comes through the parameters, this is the way it works, and he's like, yeah, no. That information may not have always been provided to you all, but it's fine. And that's important, and it happens.
And keep in mind, the property owner has he did not create this situation. The housing commission did not create the situation. The inspector did not create the situation. Time and the property owner allowed the situation to be created. Whether it's financial hardship or the general disrepair, that's what's been brought forward. We do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock because there's a wedding here, so they're going to be ask us to go. A couple of points I want to make sure we get through. Definitely ask questions. If we don't get to the questions, email them, and we'll make sure they get addressed at a later meeting. Rules of evidence, Corey touched on this. You're not strictly bound by the rules of evidence. Hearsay generally is not allowed. He said, she said, I'll raise my hand and object. Opinion evidence is generally not allowed unless it's expert opinion. And we would ask that you not discuss the case or gather your independent evidence outside of the commission hearing. If there is an objection to the evidence, the chairperson has the opportunity to sustain or overrule that objection. If a commission member disagrees, the commission member can ask for a vote, make a motion, ask for a vote, and the entire commission can vote to determine should that evidence be entered or not. I give you an example of written findings of fact, and we'll skip that, and we'll go to burden of proof. And we've had at past hearings lots of conversations on what is the burden of proof. And so more for our new commission members, I want to make sure that you understand this. If you've been to any courtroom, almost around every judge, there stands usually a lady, blindfolded, holding scales of justice in one hand and a sword in the other. That ring a bell? Folks seen that? It's a lady because when you want her out of trouble, then you go see mom or dad. Me, I didn't have a choice. She carried the sword and the scales, so she had both. But generally, you go see mom. Mom is mercy. That's why it's almost always a lady. She holds a sword because it's enforcement, blindfolded because it's supposed to be unbiased. The scale of justice, if you look at the scales, they're always tilted just a little bit. The burden of proof in these cases is greater weight of the evidence. So what that means is the scales tip slightly in favor of one party or the other based upon the credible evidence that you've heard, that party wins. In the news, you may have heard beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the criminal standard of proof. If you think in terms of math, greater weight of the evidence is greater than 51%. Beyond reasonable doubt is probably up to 90% convinced. I cannot come up with a good reason as to how this could have happened other than that person did it. That's beyond a reasonable doubt. Convinced is, I can't come up with any reason whatsoever. Greater weight of the evidence is the bare minimum in civil court, the burden of proof. It's simply this side had better evidence, even if it's just by a hair, that's the burden of proof that the city has to meet and that the opposing party has to meet. Emotions, opinions, unless they're expert, sympathies, political concerns are not evidence. You see a picture of exposed wiring. It's 3 feet off the ground. Whether there are children in the house or not, it's exposed wiring. I can't afford to repair it. It's really not that bad. We keep a screen around it. You know, we're not scared of it. There's no power to the wiring. We don't turn it on. That may be some evidence, but the question is there exposed wiring? Does it violate the housing code? Is that a major violation? We don't think it's that bad. We can't afford it. That's not evidence before you. That's not credible evidence that you can consider that may tip those scales. And the city's obligation in presenting the case is to present a case that tips the scales in favor of supporting that inspector's order. Part of that is also making sure that we have presented you evidence that we have complied with the due process requirements. We issued a complaint, we issued a notice of hearing, we had the hearing within a sufficient period of time, we issued an order, we received an appeal. That appeal is now before you, and we have to show you evidence, testimony, photographic, that that house, the conditions of that house, meets the violations that we presented to you at that time. Any questions about burden of proof? Common cases that you're going to hear. Inspector's order to repair or to demolish. And again, this is order, not ordinance. Order means property owner is still in charge of the property. It may be 30, could be 60 days before you hear this appeal. The question is, at the time that the inspector issues that order, did the conditions of that house meet those violations as stated? It's not at the time that you hear the case. They may have done work over that 30, 60 days. We certainly hope that they did. But to make sure that we have enforcement capabilities should we need it, we're going to ask you to support that order at the time that the order was issued, if it's an appeal of that order. So we're going to present evidence of the house that it existed at the time that the order was issued. In the past, commission members have asked for evidence of what the house looks like now. If we're asking you to support an order, you're likely to hear me to say it's irrelevant. Because we're looking at that snapshot of that day, what was the condition of the house, to support the order. When we come back and ask you for an ordinance to demolish or repair, that's when it's very critical for the commission to say, we want to see what the house looks like now. If property owner is 75% of the way to repair, and we're asking you to demolish first, you're not going to get that case. We're not going to waste your time or ours. If they're that close, then we're likely going to work and get them to finish on. But then you want to see what's the house look like now before we give the city the authority to go onto the property and demolish. We want to make sure that today's date, this house is worthy of demolition. And so you'll see current evidence of conditions that meet those major minor violations, and that the construction cost would exceed 50% of the tax value to warrant demolition of the property.
And the reason that you're looking at what he's saying, the reason you're looking at the current is because when you're looking to uphold that inspector, that is a fail to comply hearing. You're looking at what is the current condition so you can see whether they have or have not complied. Remember in the beginning, what he said in the beginning is with what evidence did the inspector consider in making their decision? But when we're getting an ordinance, not only are you checking to see that there's more than 5 minor violations or one major that's still existing, because that ordinance hearing is a failure to comply hearing. It's irrelevant what was shown at the beginning, because if they didn't appeal it, it's still done by ordinance. The ordinance says that order is the law. But now we're having a failure to comply hearing, and we're going to be, the evidence we're going to show you the violations and what's still remaining, but we're going to prove to you everything we've done along the way, and the owner has still failed to comply. And I know that was a statement that you've always made for that hearing, and maybe that helps you to differentiate, because we don't want you to get confused. But there at the end, we now need an ordinance. This is the end, and they have failed to comply. Not that, well, we got their attention now, we want to work. We're now at this point here. So have they in fact failed to comply? And as you've seen in other cases, even when you've adopted an ordinance, if they're still working on the houses, that's why we're rescinding cases. When I first came to the city, there was 198 cases on the demolition list. That number is now down to 124. And I have not knocked down 74 houses. We keep working. Even when you adopt the ordinance, the inspector keeps working with the owner, and we get that compliance.
The other case that you may hear, the civil penalty reduction appeal we've talked about again, it's going to be, was the notice issued, was the penalty correctly calculated, was it correctly reduced, and does it comply with the policy? Those would be the questions that are presented to you. Continuances, and this has come up in past meetings, and as I mentioned with the timeline, big thing with continuances is if it is an order to repair, an order to demolish, if that hearing to hear that appeal is continued, that notice of lis pendens is not yet recorded. The public is not yet on notice. We will greatly continue to urge you not to continue the case, to hear the case, and let's get the order in place, if it should be in place, so that we can notify the public, and so that we can start that timeline of giving the person time to repair before we have to issue civil penalties. In the past, there have been, well, we're going to give them time to comply before we support this order. You're taking enforcement possibilities away from staff, and we're really not supporting the order, the order or the ordinance. But at the same time, we can't issue that lis pendens and put the public on notice. So if that owner sells the property, and we now have a buyer who says there was nothing in public notice, if it's an appeal, they're not going to get the public notice. So that's why we would ask you to limit continuances only in incredibly unusual circumstances, and the ordinance requires that you make the appropriate findings to indicate when you continue cases. Same with the demolition. If we bring you a request for a demolition ordinance, it's going to come to you, and evidence is going to be pretty obvious that there's a failure to comply, continuing to give additional time, and simply leaving unsafe housing out there for additional time. And I think the evidence for that would be obvious. Right.
So, 900.
Unless they appeal it, you won't see it. You generally will only see it if we're asking for an ordinance. And again, the biggest practice change from staff is to only bring you cases when we are ready to effectuate the situation where we need to take it down or need receivership and repair. We're not going to get no one set settlement goals. We can protect the chain of title for lis pendens. That's the other thing. We were using the ordinance to protect the chain of title. We're now going to use that lis pendens option way at the very beginning to protect the chain of title. That gives us flexibility to work with folks until we're just So there's simply a failure to comply, and we need the ordinance, and we need to law.
But if they don't come to us,
The state law allows us, at the issuance of the inspector's order, if it's not appealed, if it is appealed, when you support that order, then state law allows us to issue the list pending. The only thing list pending says is that there's a pending action, beware. It's a buyer beware. The ordinance is, there's an ordinance to demolish this house. You know, and again, the physical condition of the house is going to put them on notice there as well. Public meetings, all of your meetings are public. If you meet outside of a meeting, 4 or more members, and if you discuss housing commission business, that's a public meeting. It's a very public meeting. Anything you discuss at that meeting is subject to being revealed at the next meeting. If you have a group email with more than 4 housing commission members, you discuss business, that becomes a public meeting. If we send a broadcast, or if I send a broadcast with a legal opinion, I'll likely put in there, please do not reply all. You may reply to me. Replying all can create a public meeting. Meeting adjourned, y'all stand up. If there's some issue at the meeting that was hot, y'all gather behind the dais and start having a conversation about that. You're extending the public meeting. If you're a lawyer, I say, gang, you can't have this conversation about business. You're continuing the public meeting and it's been adjourned. It's just something to keep in mind. Y'all all want to go out to dinner, that's fine, just don't talk about commission business. But understand, if you're seen out in public, it's going to raise kind of a suspicion, is this a commission meeting? Not that would happen, but it's just something to be, aware of. There is a provision in North Carolina law for closed sessions. It is not likely that y'all would ever have an issue that could warrant a closed session under North Carolina law. If you think there should be a basis for closed session, you may ask. I can almost guarantee you my answer is going to be no. You're not entitled to advice of counsel, because if you're sitting as a quasi-judicial board, you're the judge. I cannot have a conversation with you outside of the other party. So you cannot get legal advice independent of the other party. You're the judge under those circumstances. As an advisory board, there's no need for me to give you advice to the exclusion of the public. That privilege only applies to the city council and the city attorney. So I really can't think of any reason why you would need to go into closed session. You can ask the time, we can consider it. It's highly important. Ethical issues, the slide is there. I think a lot of this is commentary. If you got a bias, let us know. If you have a conflict of interest, you need to let us know. Avoid the embarrassment of, that comes out later. Your decisions, again, are appealable to Superior Court. Again, this is something I've not done well, and I'm going to try to do a much better job of it, is creating a record that if a Superior Court judge ever hears it, that it makes sense, that there's progression of the hearing. City presented its case, questions were asked. Other parties presented its case, questions were asked. There were arguments, end of case, deliberation, finding of facts. We want to make sure that the Superior Court has a good record should anyone ever appeal our decisions, to make sure that the Superior Court says, can follow the record, competent evidence, findings of fact match the evidence, and the eventual order match the law. And the Superior Court, that's all they do. They don't give you evidence. They go through that checklist. We want the Superior Court judge to check all those boxes and uphold their decision. So I'm going to try to do a much better job of preserving that record. That's my presentation, but we do have time for any other questions. Happy to entertain them. I don't know if Corey has any information. We got about 10 minutes.
I'm gonna bring in the city clerk, because we've got to swear you in. You got to take your oath of office. So she was coming after her appointment. I saw her wave at me a while ago. So while y'all are asking questions, I'm gonna run out and grab her.
Any other questions about any of the presentation?
is this clear up?
This is really all.
You're new, so any lingering questions? Ms. Singleton? From? No, that's fine. You can ask them afterwards. A conversation here is not a public meeting. You're more than welcome to ask. And you may have a question that I may think would benefit the entire commission. I'll likely broadcast the question in our conversation to the entire commission. So don't hesitate.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you will.
I don't.
These are on our side.
Do we need, for the public meeting before we swear in, do we, any formal, since we're at a public hearing, do we need to conclude? There's, do we ever vote? Is everybody talking? Hearing no objections, I think we can close this vote.
Thank you.